Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're a couple minutes past the hour, so I think it's probably time to get started. And happy first day of the American League playoffs as well to everyone. Go Jays, go. And welcome to our webinar for September 29th, entitled Beginning with the End in Mind, Building Documentation and Metadata to Support Data Deposit and Preservation. My name is Jennifer Abel, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. This is the second webinar in our co-presented series with Global Water Futures. This series aims to educate researchers and data professionals across Canada on research data management best practices and tools that are available to support them. These webinars will help participants navigate the evolving RDM landscape as funders, publishers, and the research community increasingly require good RDM practices. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. As I said, today's webinar is on beginning with the end in mind, building documentation and metadata to support data deposit and preservation. Descriptive documentation will protect the integrity and value of your data and ensure its usefulness for current and future research projects. This webinar will explore what types of information are needed to make your data findable and accessible, and what information will help ensure it stays useful in the long term. An overview of commonly required metadata fields will be highlighted through a comparison of popular metadata standards and repository deposition guides. Processes to build supporting documentation through the data generation process, such as ReadMe files and standard operating procedures, will be illustrated, and there'll be examples as well. A few housekeeping notes before we start. You have been muted automatically when you enter the room, but we will be able to unmute you during the question period if appropriate. This webinar is being recorded, and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage you to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features, including security updates. Please use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties or have additional resources to share, but please use the Q&A option to ask questions of the presenters. Questions will be addressed at the end. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask a question, and we can unmute you. Questions may be asked in English or French. They will be answered most likely in English. We do have a code of conduct that we follow during these webinars, which you can find at the link on the screen, and I'll put it in the chat as well in a minute. Carl and the Portage Network are committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for its staff, membership, committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of Carl meetings and events. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind. Our presenters today are Krysha Dukacz and Erin Clary. Krysha holds a BA Honors in Geography, a GIS Specialist Certificate, and an MBA in Management of Information Systems. She's worked in the public sector at the federal level with Environment Canada and the NHRC, and at the municipal level for the City of Ottawa and the City of Saskatoon, as well as in the private and academic sectors. As the data manager for Global Water Futures at McMaster, Krysha works with GWF researchers to develop and implement effective data management procedures to protect valuable research assets. And Erin Clary is the curation coordinator for the Canadian Association of Research Libraries Portage Network. She reviews new dataset deposits for the Federated Research Data Repository, or FRDR, and as a member of Portage's curation expert group, she is engaged in developing resources to support a national curation community of practice. She was previously a curator with Dryad Digital Repository and has curated data for the Data Curation Network. Erin studied biology and holds an MLIS from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And we are very glad to have them with us today. And I will now turn the pixelated floor over to them.
Okay, thanks very much, Jen, and welcome to everyone. I'm going to share my screen now, and we will get started. So this webinar kind of came about. Erin and I have been working on this, on trying to condense a lot of information into this webinar. We created the description early on and have done our best to meet what was described in the description, but it is an awful lot of information to condense, and we're hoping to tell a story on how you can take your data from being your own, just something that you have for yourself and for meeting your own research needs, not only to meet those needs, but also how it can be used to broaden and share knowledge and build new knowledge. So the title of the presentation, beginning with the end in mind, is speaking to the fact that to enable yourself to deliver on what comes at the end, you have to think of it from the very beginning. So I will carry on here. So there is the rhyme of the ancient mariner, which has the water, water everywhere, but not a drop to drink. I was thinking of this in the context of how we currently have so much data in our environment. There's so much data being collected by researchers across the country and across the world, also by many instruments, and it's making that data something that is usable and meaningful is very difficult. So the rhyme of the modern researcher is data everywhere, but where is the data that I need? Or where, am I able to figure out the coding system? Is it in a format that I can use? And is it appropriate to my purpose? Am I allowed to share it? All of these questions are things that metadata will provide. So generally speaking, in the world today, we see that there is a lot of data. It's been called the data is the new oil, is something that's been bantered about. And particularly at this time when we're dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, I find it very interesting from a data perspective, because there is so much data out there. Some people have been successful in harnessing it, but there have been issues that have been noted. So on this slide, I have the mapping dashboard for the Johns Hopkins dashboard showing the COVID-19. And this has been active since very early on in the pandemic. And they have taken hundreds of data sources and very nicely brought it together, but that takes a lot of work. Another example of how data can be used by people, to communicate information is this gentleman, Ryan Imgrund, who reports every day, multiple times a day, sometimes, on the COVID rates in Ontario. So it struck me on Saturday, I was reading the newspaper, and there was this article by, I guess, an opinion piece by Sylvia Steed, who indicated that journalists need to know more about COVID-19 transmission for the sake of all of us. She noted that the absence of standards, the diversity of sources of data, provincial, territory, regional, all of that diversity makes it very difficult for data to be pulled together and to be made into something that tells a story. They indicated that it took 10 days to collect the data and make it comparable, that the data availability was spotty, and also indicated variability in the data format that data was delivered in. These issues that were stated in this article echo the very issues that are addressed by research data management, and so I find it quite telling that this is something that needs to be addressed, certainly within the research and academic communities, and at the certainly the public realm as well. So another call for sharing data publicly, or publicly funded data. We have at GWF, we have a young professionals group, and earlier this year they put out a paper in hydrological processes that identified some of the challenges that they found in in doing their research. And some of this was that funding for data collection was often focused on long-term sites, concentrating the data control. And that is something that's because data does cost so much, and long-term records are very difficult to find. Also that there is hidden data that sometimes doesn't make it off of a computer, you know, in a lab because it wasn't relevant necessarily to the specific research question being tackled by a researcher. Some of it's proprietary, and some, again, pointing that also highlights what was mentioned by Sylvia Steed, is that often data is collected by in different jurisdictions, and having to pull those data together is challenging. So, so basically, they really they espoused in their paper that there needed to be a cultural shift in the sharing of data. It also pointed to this article, you know, the Arctic Understanding Limited by Patchy Fieldwork Scientists say. And in this article, it indicates that, again, funds are being concentrated in smaller long-term sites. And what this might mean is that, you know, the whole picture isn't being clearly defined or clearly interpreted. So as we move into the academic realm, data management is certainly becoming a much more high priority topic. The tri-agency is has two, well, I'm just going to mention two of the policies that they are looking at, and that they have put forth as requirements for obtaining tri-agency funding, is the Statement of Principles on Digital Data Management. And in this is an active policy that has a number of expectations, including data management planning, constraints and obligations, adherence to standards, collection and storage of metadata, preservation, retention, and sharing, and those are already requirements. There's also an impending tri-council agency research data management policy that, again, focuses on bringing strong data management to universities and to researchers, looking with the aim that those elements are really what provides the groundwork for research excellence. So in this policy, it's kind of bringing together the responsibility and broadening that so that researchers can be supported in their research data management, and promoting reproducibility, discoverability, and reusability. So if we look at the cost of data, data collection is a very costly pursuit. It includes personnel, the salaries and benefits, infrastructure costs. It can range from instrumentation to travel costs, the lab analysis or processing, ensuring that data is quality controlled. And it also includes the kind of blood, sweat, and tears of people who are in the field collecting data. And sometimes it's notable to acknowledge that often data can be irreplaceable. It might be collecting data at a point in time, such as some climate data, some environmental data. And because of that, it's very important that that data be preserved. So if we move on to the value of data, there's the cost of data, but there's the value of data. And the value of data is not necessarily in the data itself, but it's in the ability for us to elicit information from that data. And to elicit the information from the data, we need to ensure that that data has the required documentation to give it context. And note that the value of data, if it can be reused, will augment that value. So when the government is looking to ensure that researchers are using data and sharing data, that it will increase the amount of increase the value of that data over time. And if we look at this information content slide, or sorry, on the slide, we see that when you're most knowledgeable about the data and the value of the data is greatest the closer it is to collection. So as we talk about metadata collection and documentation, it's crucial that we have you know, that information about the collection process, about who was there, and all of those aspects are collected as close to the time of collection, or sorry, are brought together and written down as close to the time of collection as possible. Because as you can see from this this graph, the information content will decline as time passes. So what is metadata? Metadata, as mentioned or alluded to, is a subset of the core data documentation. Documentation is a critical component of data. It's not separate from data, but it must come and be tied to data, to the data set, in order for that data set to be complete. You want to understand the who, the what, the where, the when, the how, and in order to provide the context for yourself in 10 years to understand what that data was about, or for someone else, a colleague or another researcher, to understand what your data was all about. And this helps people to know of any issues, whether any issues with the quality, if that collection method is something that's in accordance with what they're working on, if it's usable by them. So again, beginning with the end in mind, this is kind of a take on one of the 7 Habits of Effective, Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And it gets across the idea that everything has kind of 2 creations. So we have to first create in our mind what we want to build. And that's a very loose interpretation of that, but that's where that line came from. And so basically we need to know where we want to end up to know how we can get there and to chart that path. The data can be protected. How we can how we can protect the data is by making that plan. And there are the data management plans that are part of many funding requirements. We'll touch on all of these things. And there is the Portage Data Management Assistant that can help to guide you on developing a data management plan. It includes all of the aspects that are critical in someone understanding and capturing the use of the data. So in this small diagram, you can see that the work that you do at the project level and the active level are the kernel of any kernel of all else. So what you do at the beginning and within your lab or your research group will lay the foundation for what will become the legacy of that. So the benefits of well-documented data are increasing efficiency, ease of collaborative work, credit, and impact. Publishing requirements are there to ensure that there's rigorous peer review, that there's the capacity for validation and reproducibility, and so to maintain the journals and publications as a defensible authority. As well, the funders are looking to achieve transparency, accountability, and return on investment. Money that is put into public endeavors, from Open Data Canada to the tri-agency that's funding the researchers at institutions, Canadian universities and research institutions, that needs to be protected and enhanced so that we want the data to be sustainable and not a throwaway, not to diminish a single project, but if data collected in a single project can then be used to catapult new research and to add to the story, it's much better, and that return on investment increases. So this is the end. So in the end, we're looking to share data potentially with through one of many data portals, and the other benefit of doing this, of doing proper research data management and doing creating solid metadata, is the journal publications, and also simply personal accomplishment and a sense of control. And I was a couple of weeks ago, I was looking through my Twitter feed, and this professor from the University of Saskatchewan and a friend of mine had written this tweet that I've included. It says, oh, sorry. Today I've accomplished something in my career of which I am more proud than even passing my defense or tenure and promotion. Today I opened a program that I wrote a year ago, and it still totally makes sense to me and does exactly what I think it should do. So perhaps that's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I think that there is a real excitement when you reopen something that you haven't touched in a long, long time, and it still makes complete sense. So apparently that was a very well received tweet, and from personal experience, I know that it's excellent. It's an excellent feeling. So sorry to take so much time in the build up there, but in building your metadata and creating proper documentation that will give you all of those benefits of being able to understand where your data is, what your data is, and not only have yourself in 10 years understand exactly what you were doing and in the context for that data, but also to potentially share it and meet the expectations for funding requirements and for data deposition. There are some tools and some things that you can integrate into your workflow that will help you to maintain those records. And it's important to note that when you're building metadata, it really is a building process. The data management plan will help projects, like large projects and individual researchers, because it will enable you to think of the things that need to be documented for preservation and long-term maintenance of that value. So when we look at these, we've got these tools that we will look at. So the standard operating procedure, I'll pass it off in just a moment to my co-presenter, Erin. But standard operating procedures are useful in that you're documenting step-by-step pieces of your research flow that are critical and to understanding data. And this could be your field visit SOP, so that it serves not only to remind, as a planning tool, but also to remind people in the field how to go through each of the steps. Instrument setup, which it also helps people to understand the data, and last but not least, the data management structures. So these are an opportunity to introduce best practices into your workflow. There's step-by-step instructions and serve as a framework. They allow for consistency between different people and over time, and can be very time-saving in that nobody has to reinvent the wheel. So I'll carry on. So here are just a couple of examples of standard operating procedures. Again, if you have a series of standard operating procedures for your lab or for yourself, it will save you time in the long run. because when you're starting a new project or you have a new installation, you're starting a new site or a new survey, you will have these documents to refer back to. Standard operating procedures can also be used really effectively in working on your file organization and your file naming, which will be discussed in a couple slides. The next aspect or component or tool that you have for your metadata collection is field notes and log files. And there are a number of different methods that can be used. There's the tried and true field notes, field notebooks where you're actually writing notes. There are new aspects of technology that allow for collection apps and collection tools online. And all of these are really important because they capture the environment and the small details about what was going on when you were doing your data collection. So it could be, it could make note of the conditions of the day. It was raining, it wasn't raining, any issues that were occurring, maybe a sensor fell down or was damaged in some way. And it could also talk to give context to how interviewees were, how they were behaving or how they were interacting with people. Anyway, all of these small details will, you want to consider capturing those conditions and those making notes of abbreviations and those bits to that kind of provide the context and remind you of situations that could that were pertinent to the day or the time at the time of data collection. So I will pass it on to, the field notes and log files. Here's an example from one of our researchers, Dr. Karen Kidd in the Kidd Lab at McMaster. And I met with her project coordinator and lab manager a few months ago, and he showed me this field note and log file that they use in their data collection. And what I really liked about this was that their field notes and log file book contained information that outlined exactly what needed to be done when they were in the field. It also provided the standard operating procedures that were relevant to that data collection and presented it in a way that was easily referred back to. The field book was printed on Write in the Rain paper, which I thought was very clever given the environment that they were working in. And it was bound so that they had a cohesive record. So just a quick note on this type of collection method, creating your field notes and log files. Sometimes you can do it electronically or, through apps and things like that. Sometimes that's not practical because of site restrictions so it's always a good idea when you're in the field, if you're using this type of method, you can take a picture, without connectivity and things like that as a backup, and also taking those field notes even when you're back at your, back in the office and making sure that you have backups of all of those so that they're not, because they are vulnerable to fire and other things. So I will pass it now to Erin. Thanks.
Thanks, Krysha. So a few more metadata tips. File organization is a big one, and something that you should probably put some thought into ahead of time. So if you think about the file structure as the scaffolding for your data files, try and set up a structure ahead of time so you have a place to put things when the time comes. The structure you choose will largely depend on what makes the most sense for your project and the way you work. You might choose to organize by file type or by the particular analyses. That doesn't matter as long as you're documenting what you've done and the reasons behind it. A few tips to sort of help you stay organized. You might want to use a directory called a to file or something similar as a place where you can collect items that don't fit into your existing structure or that you haven't had time to file properly. Just a holding tank, if you will. And a couple more things to be aware of are just that most file systems have a maximum path length that they'll allow. So try to keep your names short but descriptive. Avoid using special characters, avoid using spaces in your directory names. And if possible, try to avoid very complex folder hierarchies with an overly nested directory structure. Obviously, you'll divide them as needed, but don't needlessly nest them. We put a few examples on the next slide of just a file index, file index examples. It might be helpful to, if you're going to have a ReadMe, name it something obvious, and I usually just suggest naming it ReadMe, and put that at the top level so it's accessible. You might also want to keep an index file or a file inventory for yourself with a brief description about what's contained in each directory. That would be useful if you need to share your files with external collaborators or if you expect to have people rotating on and off of a long-term study. Lastly, if there's a need to know information like the site name or date, that can be in the directory name, but bear in mind that if you move the files that are inside of that directory at a later date, you don't want to lose important information. So anything that's really important to the content of the file itself should actually be included in the file name so that it will still make sense without this directory structure. In terms of file naming, files follow some of the same conventions as the directories. File names should provide information about the content of the data file. Use descriptive names, but keep them short. You can abbreviate project names or site names and then define them in your documentation. And similar to directory names, don't use spaces, don't use special characters. Those can be handled differently by different operating systems, so and really just troublesome on the command line. Another thing is if you are collecting potentially sensitive information, don't put any of that in your file name. So no names of human participants or protected site location information. Use a code or ID and maintain a separate key file. You can link that back. Lastly, I guess dates, try to record them year, month, day, so that files will sort chronologically. And if you are creating versions, use like a V01, V02, rather than adding a final, really final. This is the final draft, just so you can keep track of which is the most authoritative version. And sorry, next slide, yeah. So just try to give each file a unique name. As mentioned above, if you need to restructure your files in the future, if the names in one directory exactly match the file names in another, it could become problematic. Be as consistent as possible in your naming conventions over the course of your project. And if you've used codes or a particular structure, just make sure to document the meaning of your file names so they're obvious to your collaborators and then also to you in the future. Okay. I think next slide. Thanks. So scripts, you might not traditionally think of scripts, macros, or syntax files as metadata, but depending on what you use them for, they do contain an exact record of the steps needed to obtain, generate, clean, process, analyze, or visualize your data. So if you use a scripted language to process and analyze your data, then any changes you've made to the raw data will be transparent to you over time. And the steps that you took will be reproducible in the future. This also is a way to, it lets you keep a copy of the raw data untouched. Then any changes you propose to make are done in the script and you generate a new output file. So then if you later found that you've made a mistake or that you've changed something that should have been left in its original form, you can update the script, reprocess those raw files, and no harm has been done. Thanks. So we received actually a great data set in Furter recently, which is a set of geotiff files that were derived from various publicly available data sources. And the researchers archived those derived raster images in Furter, but they also shared the code that was used to generate those files from the source data in GitHub, and created a second GitHub repository, which includes codes that allow an end user to access a subset of those raster images, pull them into R for modeling. And this is a fairly complex example, but I've noticed more and more that researchers are choosing to share their processing or analysis scripts, and it can be done using a resource like GitHub. It can just be a plain script file, like a .r or .m if you like MATLAB, that you archive alongside your data files, just to provide more context for the processing steps that you took. Last note is that if you do choose to use a scripted language, plan to include comments so that each line of code is human readable and so that you can easily see what the intent of that line of code was. Also make sure to keep track of any external dependencies, any specific packages or software you might have used, including the version number if possible, just in case you need to recreate the same environment in the future. Okay, another type of metadata is the ReadMe file. So a ReadMe file is intended to provide an overview of the data set. And this often includes project level metadata, such as contributors, funders, dates of collection. But it should also include file level metadata, descriptions of the files or the directories themselves. What naming conventions did you use? What information is necessary to interpret your files? And then also, if there are known anomalies, you can document all of that in your ReadMe, just making it easier for other people to understand and use your files correctly. Some tips for naming ReadMes are, again, name it something obvious like readme.txt. Include a point of contact in your file. You might choose to include a brief description of your study, the methods you used to collect your data, and any steps you took to process it. A lot of this will oftentimes end up published in an associated research article, which really will give a great in-depth context. But to keep the data set itself as understandable and usable as possible, and on the off chance that that article is behind a paywall that someone can't access, including some amount of information with the data is always beneficial. I think next slide. I don't have to read all those points, people can see them. So although ReadMes are often created at the end, only before, I guess only before data are shared, it's actually something that you might want to think about creating earlier in the data collection process, and you can update it as the project progresses. That's another way that you don't end up at the end wanting to share your data and having to go back and look at each directory and jot it down and note what it describes and try and figure out what your naming conventions were. If you just do a little bit at a time, hopefully it saves you time in the end. So on the previous slide, there were a couple of resources that have great guidance for writing ReadMes. One is from UBC, another from Cornell. So we've linked to those if you want further information. Okay, so no metadata discussion is complete without a little bit about standards. I'll try and make this fast because I know we're running short on time, but the chart here shows some terms from general purpose metadata standards like Dublin Core and DataCite. And these are used by a lot of general purpose repositories. Furter uses them, Dataverse uses some of these elements, Zenodo and Dryad. These are all elements that describe your data set or your research project as a whole. And can be used for discovery. So a few important things to bear in mind are, give your data set a descriptive title that will work in a data citation. Don't just call it my data, or, you know, if someone's going to actually cite or attribute your work, make sure it's something that, I guess, similar to an article publication. Another thing is just remember that the rights or the terms that you can assign to your data might be limited if you use data from a third-party source. So don't share anything you don't have permission to redistribute. And for data or derived products that you can share, just make sure you select terms that respect those that were assigned to your original data source. So it might be helpful if you are planning to use secondary data, keep a copy of that license or the original terms of use under which the data were provided to you with your data throughout the project. So when it comes time to share, there's no question about where did it come from, you know, what was I allowed to do with it? And yeah, this isn't all elements. There are other elements that'll be generated automatically by the repository platform when your data are published. Like a unique identifier such as a DOI or an accession number, the dataset publisher, and the type of resource. But this is information that you'll commonly be asked to provide. Oh, slide, thanks. So if you do choose to deposit your data in a repository, we recommend filling in as much of that required and recommended information as you can. A repository might not require keywords or a description, but these are elements that will aid in discovery and also provide context to your data and how it can be used. So this slide shows an example of how data sets that are archived in the Scotty Creek Research Station Dataverse are also discoverable in the Wilfrid Laurier University Dataverse. Those are harvested and indexed in Furter's National Discovery Layer. And in the near future, Furter will be feeding this metadata into OpenAIRE for international discovery. So it behooves you to just describe things well if you want people to find your research. Slide, thanks. So disciplinary metadata standards can be very complex. These capture granular information about your data, and they're generally useful for both discoverability and usability. Some disciplinary repositories might actually require that you use one of these more complex disciplinary standards. Using one of these standards is something you might want to consider at a project's inception. Even if you think you'll ultimately share your data in a general purpose repository, a disciplinary standard, if you read through it, can illustrate what some of the important metadata to capture or document are, and can also help you organize information that's necessary to interpret or use your data in a structured manner. We've listed a few examples of metadata standards here. EML for ecological and environmental sciences, there's DICOM for medical imaging, DDI for social and behavioral sciences. The ISO 19115 standard for geographic information is actually useful or used by many disciplines. And once you've selected a standard that you might want to use, there are a lot of tools out there that can help you generate or validate the metadata files you're creating. We've linked to a few here. There's also a couple good resources at the bottom, like the RDA Metadata Standards Working Group, that have more examples of resources and more tools that you might find useful. Slide, please. So when it comes to developing metadata or documentation, consider using a collaborative resource so that multiple people can contribute. Prefer tools with a versioning feature that will allow you to build documentation as a project progresses. And that'll also help you keep track of what's the most recent or authoritative version of the file. Now, there are a ton of options available, and we've just listed a few resources here, which are all free options, and that allow researchers to create private documents or private projects and share them with specific collaborators. The next slide shows a chart with a little more details about some of those, which I won't go into a lot of depth here, but just to say, like, some of these, like Google Drive is very simple, but it has a low barrier of entry. It's an easy way to collaborate on documentation. You could consider using Google Forms to collect a standard set of metadata elements. If you like the form approach, Cedar Workbench also uses that, but has the ability to create richer, like more complex forms than what you could do with Google. It was created specifically for the biomedical sciences, so a lot of their pre-existing templates are geared to that domain, but anyone can use the application and anyone can develop their own template within it. GitHub and OSF are also two resources that are widely used for sharing documentation. OSF is great for project management as well. If you eventually want your documentation to be available as a web-based resource, you know, GitHub Pages is one option you might choose. And I guess just so you're aware, there's two upcoming webinars next week. One from UBC, the Research Commons is hosting a data management workshop series that's open to everyone. That's on October 5th, and that's an introduction to the open science framework. And then the next webinar in this series is what it'll dive into GitHub, setting up repositories, how you can use them to collaborate and enhance reproducibility. And that's on October 6th at 1 o'clock Eastern. I think one further thing I wanted to note is if you do need to collect or store sensitive data or metadata, please speak to your research group's data manager or someone in your library or your research office who will have an idea of what secure storage options are available at your institution. Don't just dive into using one of these if you're going to be gathering sensitive information without first confirming that there's a way to protect or encrypt that. Okay, so in summary, I think the most important thing you can do is really just put some thought into how you want to structure your data and what documentation will be necessary to understand and use it from the beginning. Ideally, it happens at the start of a project, but it's never too late to just make small changes. As long as you do have a plan and have documented your processes, you can use it to sort of refocus and bring yourself back to the center if things start to slide, as they do. Time always moves more quickly than we think it will. So let's see. I guess that is one thing. Just make sure you've budgeted time in your project plan, both to create and maintain documentation. You might need initial time in the beginning to sort of plan and structure things, and then just the maintenance you'll have to do throughout. Unexpected things come up all the time. Weather or an instrument failure might delay your data collection in the field. So try and add a buffer to the time you allotted for metadata so it doesn't just get edged out by other competing priorities. It's maybe not the most exciting part of your work, but it's an important part that will make the analyses easier in the end. Let's see, I think next slide. Next slide is just a checklist of a few of the things that we discussed to help you sort of think through, you know, whether or not your data are ready to share. And it doesn't have to be sharing in a repository. You know, it might just be sharing with your collaborators within your research group, or it might be sharing with someone at another institution. But there's some things like having standard operating procedures that will help you manage things consistently. Consider how you've named your files and how you've structured them, whether you have a ReadMe codebook or the necessary documentation to interpret your data correctly, et cetera, et cetera. And just a reminder again that tools like the DMP Assistant can help you think through what documentation and metadata will be useful for managing your project. And as long as you keep in mind that information, what is needed to make your data accessible, you should be then prepared to share your data with collaborators at any time. If you do have questions about metadata or documentation, a data manager who works with your research group or someone at your library should be able to help. So just don't hesitate to ask. They have lots of good resources and tools and tips that they'd be willing to share. And I think, sorry, it's a little rushed there at the end, but I wanted to try and leave a few minutes for questions.
Well, thanks so much, Erin and Krysha. And if anyone has questions, please feel free to raise your hand or to pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom. I know there was a lot of information in that webinar, so yeah, any and all questions are welcome. Oh, we have a question from Kevin Lindstrom. Do you have any guidance regarding CC0 versus CC BY? So talking about Creative Commons licenses.
I always try to think, I mean, I worked at Dryad for a few years and all the data in Dryad are actually CC0. And the reason they selected to use that license was that thinking in this like data are facts, you know, and so therefore they're not copyrightable. A lot of research is funded by public dollars, and so the commodity should be available for anyone else to use. But that doesn't mean, I mean, yes, so there are no restrictions on public domain license. Technically, you could use the data without citing it, but that's not the best scholarly practice. I feel happy though with CC BY as well, which is just requiring that people provide attribution. That is the best practice, and that should be happening whether the data are CC0 or CC BY. I don't know if that answers your question. You know, I think a lot of government data, the open government license requires attribution. So if you are sharing data points that you took from a previously published data set with an OGL license, you'll have to use something like CC BY.
Great, thanks for that question, Kevin. Any other questions about anything that came up? Well, I might ask a question then. Oh, another question from Kevin. Looking for metadata standards for groundwater methane.
Do you know, Krysha, or someone at Global Water Futures might know?
Yeah, I don't know offhand, but I can certainly do some, I can try and find some guidance on that and include it in the follow-up and in the documentation for the presentation that we provide.
Yeah, Kevin is noting that the lack of metadata standards is a challenge. So is that something that you've encountered in the work that you've both done?
I think from my perspective, in terms of the challenge in finding a metadata standard that's very domain specific, there aren't, you know, necessarily that many of them that are very tailored to a specific domain. And so I think what the critical thing is to, I guess, look for best practices and standards in the data collection, in the collection of groundwater methane, understand, all of the methodology with respect to that collection and how it's documented in terms of the method. And then I think that that as long as you're adhering to those best practices for the domain, the metadata standard is perhaps less critical, in that as long as you're providing that information to support your data and the information that other researchers would need, the standard isn't necessarily such a paramount concern. That being said, there are some pushes, I think, in terms of domain specific, such as water quality, where there's a push to kind of hone in on a standard. That being said, if there's an existing one, you kind of have to just tailor and ensure that the critical pieces and elements are included in your documentation, and then meet, decide if you're going to publish the data, pick the repository and adhere to those standards. But I think that there is some latitude and some room for including information that's relevant to your field.
Looks like Balika also just shared the ISO 19115 standard. That's the World Meteorological Organization core metadata standard. And she said it's a good start for groundwater.
I would agree with that. Yeah, for sure, Balika. The 19115 is a geographic standard, and it will enable you to capture information about, any data that has a spatial component, of which I assume groundwater methane may. And so again, I think that standard is a great start, and again, it would be tailored. Geographic information is very broad, and so it would, the information that you would provide would be meeting the requirements of the researchers in your field.
Great, thank you. We have a hand raised by Tanya Brown. Tanya, I'm going to allow you to talk, and you can ask your question.
Unmute myself. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. My question's more around supporting the feasibility of having data management plans that are so extensive. I work in the neurospace, and some of our data is considered quite big data. So a lot of the management that goes into those data sets is quite extreme. And I haven't really seen much support coming from the actual funding organizations in terms of supporting kind of this additional workload that comes upon researchers when we're dealing with data of this stature. And I was wondering if anyone was familiar with any granting organizations that have recognize sort of this added work in terms of the dollar support, or recognizing other additional roles that could be supported through some of their granting streams, such as like data managers, if that's something anybody is familiar with, or if there is any actions being taken to try and push initiatives such as that.
I think it is coming to light more and more. And, I think as funders start requiring data management plans and requiring researchers to do this, then they'll have to allow for some of these things to be budgeted in, which doesn't help, if you're working on existing funds and you didn't budget for those sorts of things, but hopefully moving forward. And we linked to it from one of the slides, and now I can't remember which, but Open Air, or the Horizon 2020 project in the EU, has created this research data management costing tool that sort of lists out all of these like 15 different steps that might be considered part of data management, a description of what each one is, and then also gives an estimate, on how much time you might expect someone to spend on that, which I don't know if that answers your question, but at least, I think people are thinking about it. It is known that this is a huge responsibility.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah. Just to add to that, the draft RDM policy, the tri-agency policy, is I think very much acknowledging the costs and looking at how the funder and the researcher and the institution can work together to provide support for the costs surrounding RDM.
Yeah, I'll note that our Portage director is on this webinar today, Jeff Moon. Jeff, do you have anything you want to say about this? I'm sure you have many thoughts.
Thanks for your your text there, Jennifer. I will admit that I've been sort of multitasking while this last question round has been going. So I am quite literally bouncing from one meeting to another. I'm wondering if somebody could just rephrase or reframe the question, and I'll then give it a stab.
Getting funding from funding agencies for RDM.
Okay, well, at the risk of being repetitive, and I sincerely apologize because I'm toing and froing with Andrio as we speak, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, you can put a line item in your budget for that. I think if that's probably what already Krysha and Aaron have responded, and I would certainly encourage folks to do that. In fact, I think that there are instances in my experience with the RDM service that we were running at Queen's University where researchers would come in and say, how much does it cost for your RDM service? And we told them it costs nothing. We just ask of you to put a line item into your budget request to the funders saying that you want to do data management, and that will be payment to us enough, because then if you have a data manager on your project, it makes the job so much easier for the data curator downstream. So I would certainly encourage people to take advantage of that and not consider it, as some people do, taking money out of a grad student's pockets in terms of doing RA work or whatever, but rather expanding the culture of data management among those who would be paid to do this kind of work as part of a project. There.
For an extemporaneous response, Jeff, that was great.
Yeah. I think too, Jeff, in that comment where you're adding it to the budget line, even though there isn't any out of pocket to the researcher in your scenario, there is really important, because when you're thinking about maintaining your assets and the sustainability, you're at some point, the money's going to need to be there to make it sustainable, and so I think that was a great way to convey that it does have an actual cost and needs to be addressed. So like that. Yeah,
there is no way around that. I mean, but the money that you'd spend, and again, I think it is a professional practice for graduate students these days. And I think graduate students who are given the opportunity to be data managers on a given project and ride herd on all the things that you guys have been talking about so ably, it's just an opportunity for them to become better researchers themselves, and I think more marketable. So there's a whole lot of incentives, in my view, for putting those line items into current grants so that in the future, it'll all be done so much better.
Great, thanks so much. Any other questions? I'll mention that we will be sending out the slides to everyone, as well as a link to the recording of the webinar in a few days. And the presenters will be copied on the email that you'll be receiving. So if you have any questions for them, you can email them directly, or you can always get in touch with us at Portage and we can direct you to the right people. Seeing no further questions, then I will thank our presenters today. Thank you so much, Krysha and Aaron, for that great overview of what we need to keep in mind so that we can use our data in the future. And I will remind you all as well that we do have more webinars coming up. We have one next week, as mentioned, by Jay Brodeur talking about how to use GitHub, and we have one on Wednesday as well from Dan Phillips at Dalhousie talking about the abstract field in repository metadata information. So hopefully we'll see you for both of those webinars, and thank you again, Krysha and Aaron, and hope the rest of you have, everybody, Krysha and Aaron included, have a wonderful rest of your day. And I will just say one more time, go Jays, go.